2011, no intellectually honest person thinks 2001 has anything to do with this. I promise you that. It says specifically we're going after the enemies who attacked us. ISIS had nothing to do with that. Nobody in Niger has anything to do with 9/11, other than they have sort of this ideology of radical Islam. But I don't think we gave the executive branch a blanket authority just to go to war anywhere they want against people who they say are a part of radical Islam. Ultimately, there's going to have to be diplomacy involved in this as well. How are we ever going to end the war? Is there ever an end to this war? But really,
Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Thank you.
How are you, Dr. Paul?
Oh, very well, thank you. We just watched a little clip from a hearing held yesterday.
I recognize that
I
senator.
think I've recognized him too.
Yeah.
And of course, I thought he was doing a pretty good job on there. We've mentioned just recently, matter of fact, I think yesterday, about the coming up of the hearings and the potential legislation to reauthorize the use of military force. So it's been around for a long time. I think the last time they got halfway serious about it was 6 years ago. And of course, they're dealing with something that was established in 2001. And I thought an interesting point was that every member on the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee that's there today, none of them were there to vote for the original, the use of military force after 9/11. So that shows you how things move along. But the big argument is where do they get this authority? Of course, we've been talking about this for months, if not years, going on how we go to war. They're so hard to stop once we get involved. And yet, the hearings yesterday, Mattis and Tillerson, they don't want any part of limitation. They want to surprise the enemy when we declare war on them, sneak up on them. Oh, well, we're at war with you. And of course, we're in all these over 100 countries, but military conflict in about 19 countries where there's battles going on. And I think it's interesting, the thing that brought attention to the public on this was Niger.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, 4 people being killed, and they singled out one person where it was put into political, in a political sense.
Yeah.
Turns out that long term, that might have been one of the most significant events. When many are killed, thousands killed. Statistics when 1 or 2 are killed, it's a big issue.
Yeah.
And right now, this Niger incident calls attention. What are they doing there? And even the senators admitted, oh, we didn't know that. And the American people, are still lulled to sleep, and they are fearful, and they believe in the propaganda, which I think they are waking up to some degree, and we continue to want to wake them up. So this big issue is what's going to happen, and we can postulate what we think will happen. But right now, I'm not very optimistic that much good will come from this. I think something will happen, but the big danger is, are they going to help, or are they going to make it worse? That's where the problem is. After Vietnam War, they had the War Powers Resolution in 1973, made things worse. So that's why we should be fearful and watching this closely.
And I think there was a misstep on the part of the White House in the Niger, because even the war hawks like McCain had to say, gosh, I didn't know there were 1,000 troops. He prides himself on war and on knowing everything about it. But, going back to the 01 resolution, and I know we've talked about this many times over the year, you struggled at the time with that vote. That was not an easy vote for you. And
Yeah.
you were probably thinking some of these things that we're seeing today, or?
Yeah, and no, it was tough. And people do still ask me, do you think that was a wrong vote? Well, in some ways, the way it turned out was wrong, but at the time, and I still would defend that position, because where the problem is they don't follow it. They didn't follow that any more than the Constitution. So you want to endorse the Constitution even though they don't follow it. So, but it said that only the nations and the groups or individuals that were involved in 9/11, we should go after them and deal with them. And I can remember it was very difficult even to get time on the House floor for that. And usually what they do, if you have an important bill like this, those in opposition would get a significant amount of time.
Yeah.
And I essentially got nothing. I think when there was a complaint made, they increased, instead of 2 minutes, they gave me 5 minutes or something like this. But And I remember saying very clearly that what we're doing here is not the answer. It's very difficult, but to do nothing seemed to me to be unacceptable because we've been attacked. And I compared it to the difficulty after Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
Not many people think about the controversy there, but nobody could oppose going to war after Pearl Harbor. And yet when you look at our policy of blockading Japan's oil, those were acts of war, but that became very academic. Nobody wanted to hear that. But on the War Powers resolution in the Constitution, in Article 1, Section 8, said that the Congress has the responsibility of declaring war and, right next to it, and grant letters of marque and reprisal. So you remember, what we did was we put some work on there, introduced legislation, thinking that this could be the compromise that the founders offered, rather than saying that every single thing you have to declare war, but you don't want to ignore it either. And we did almost the opposite, because I happen to be very suspicious of how bin Laden was handled, because they could have captured him and asked him a few questions, but they didn't want that. So they just could have considered. It might have been a good example of using the letter, define it, limit it, and send somebody there. And the whole purpose of getting bin Laden. But at Tora Bora, they said he was trapped, and all of a sudden he was in Pakistan, where he stayed ever after, and yet they had to be silent because the argument had to be it was all Afghanistan and the government's fault, which the violent individuals participating passed through Afghanistan like they passed through Spain and Florida, and a few other places. So, but now the big question is what's going to happen, and could the Congress do anything now to clarify this? Because obviously, from our discussion already, we strongly object to the idea of the distortion of the authority to use military force of 2001. Makes no sense whatsoever.
And I think Senator Paul had it perfect. And no one intellectually honest would argue that Niger has anything to do with 2001.
There's the problem. I'll have to talk to Rand. Intellectually honest, I had trouble finding those kind of people, because basically they aren't politicians. You have trouble being honest with yourself.
But the question, the quandary that we always have in issues like this, and it happened when some parts of the Patriot Act were expiring and these sorts of things, is when something expires or when you repeal something, do you replace it, and what do you replace it with? And right now the debate, as I understand it, it doesn't really include your perspective, our perspective, which is that repeal it and replace it with nothing. Because on one side, the White House is saying, don't touch it, we like it just the way it is. That's how Obama was too, and how W. Bush was. And then on the other side, you see people like Senator Corker and a few others saying, we need a new resolution, we need it to be more specific. And so we find ourselves in a sort of a weird way about this argument.
Yeah, and all presidents have resisted and declared the War Powers Resolution of 1973 as being unconstitutional. And they want to take it to the courts, and the courts have stayed out of it. But it was bad policy because it actually legalized a president to be able to go to war for 90 days before they had to do anything. But by that time, what are you going to do? Are you going to just not send any food or ammunition to the troops? You can't, it's hard for any member of Congress to deny the funds then, but if the Congress were awake and the people awake, they could say, just bring the troops home, change your policy, which we eventually did in Vietnam. It came after all the suffering and the pain and the money, and they finally had to bring the troops home, and it was such a tragedy. But under these circumstances, they don't want to hear this. They want license. And I believe it's connected to the difference between empire and republic. We have an empire. They lie us into war. They generate tremendous fear. Even in the Persian Gulf War, all kinds of fear and propaganda, and also the Iraq War with Saddam Hussein ready to drop nuclear bomb on endlessly the drumbeat of fear, and then the people say, well, you just can't ignore it. And the other thing that bothered me most was you have to sacrifice a little of your freedom, you know, and go along with this and pay the money and let the NSA come in and spy on everybody because that's the only way you can be safe. And of course, that's a gross distortion, which I think is very dangerous.
And how sad that the fear still works. I was listening to you talk about the fear just now of Iraq, and I'm thinking this is exactly what they're selling on North Korea, exactly what they're selling on Iran. And we get, you know, we enjoy the comments, but there are a lot of people that say, come on, Ron, this North Korea thing is very different. And I remember them saying, come on, Ron, this Libya thing is very different. Come on, this Iraq thing is different.
Always.
But I was just watching a video of you sparring with James Baker, the former Secretary of State. I know it's shocking that you, but it was in the committee, and you were talking about the War Powers Resolution, and you made then the point you're making now, which most people don't understand, is that it legalizes an illegal war for 90 days. You know, it abrogates the Constitution for 90 days. But probably the most important objection to it, which you've just made, is that once he's in there for 90 days, there is not a single member of the House or Senate, with maybe one or two exceptions, who would say, okay, guys, you got to come back. Nobody would do that. It's an impossibility.
No, it's and it becomes a political thing. You know, the courts have been used. The presidents and others in the administration wanted to go to the courts to get rid of the War Powers Resolution, and the courts wouldn't hear it. And then the big question comes up, is this an issue for the courts to decide? I think that's an interesting question because many times these things in the monetary issue and also in war issues, they've gone to the Supreme Court, and as it's been pointed out by Louis Fisher, that inevitably, if it gets into the courts aren't our friends. They're not friends of the Republic. They usually always ruled for the support of the executive branch, the imperial presidency. So that hasn't worked out too well. But the big question is really, is that the place for it to be worked out? The question comes up, what if a president really goes unhinged? And, you know, he's just starting big wars all over the place and he has to be stopped. Of course, I think the way our country was set up, it was still a responsibility of the people to wake up, reject support, wake up the Congress, and Congress do what they should do. I think the courts, going through the courts, is a little bit too slow. And the other option, if a president becomes unhinged and you can't get support from the court, I think then the option they offered, it becomes more political, and the option then is impeachment, you know, to deal with that. But I don't think that's what's going on today. Today is just to solidify a little bit better the executive branch power to go to war. It's been there. Nobody questions it. It's questioned occasionally, but it's always there. But I think you've already alluded to it. They're not talking about our solution. They're not talking about the Constitution. They're not talking about, well, maybe we ought to talk about this weird thing in the Constitution, mark and reprisal. What does that mean? Maybe that is an option where you don't have to ignore the attackers if they're a small little group attacking us and go after the individual rather than declaring war on the world. We've literally declared war on the world. Any place in the world now under 9/11, it's preposterous how they've extended their power. But we should not be surprised. This is the natural tendency of empires and a natural tendency of an executive branch of government. The founders knew it, and that's why the founders said it shouldn't be in the hands of the executive branch. It has to be in the hands of the Congress. So yes, there'll be the neocons. Sometimes they like what Trump does. Sometimes they don't like him, and they criticize him. And he's getting criticized from all over, and I will too on some of these policy. But really, it's the Congress. I mean, it's the Senate. It's the House. They have to do something, but they just are lapdogs. They just go along with it, and they participate in the propaganda because they have preconceived ideas, because they do believe in the empire. They believe we have this moral responsibility of spreading American goodness, our exceptionalism, and that we're on moral high ground. Well, there's a few of us that don't believe that our foreign policy is on the moral high ground when you look at the number of people that we have killed in the last 20 years. And we have to also count the innocent people, you know, the citizens and the fellow, you know, the people who are just inadvertently killed,
Yeah.
you know.
Collateral damage.
Yeah, there you go. They make up fancy names for just slaughtering the innocents.
You know, I'm trying to remember back at one of the lunches. I think it was Professor Turley. I may be wrong, but he had the interesting point that if the courts rule in a way that the legislature thinks is wrong, they should simply pass legislation against that ruling. You know, so he's arguing for much stronger legislature, even opposing the courts. And you know, in this case, that might work. You know, in the problem identified by Louis Fisher. But the one thing I was thinking, you were talking about Markham Reprisal, you brought it up a couple of times. And don't you think, I mean, this is probably the first indication that they weren't serious about the people who did 9/11 when they rejected the Markham Reprisal idea. They didn't even entertain the idea. I think it's because they had far bigger plans than just
yes.
9/11.
I mean, that was the big thing. They went into Afghanistan. We should have known exactly how this authority to use military force would work, because they said, well, that's why we have to go after Iraq. At least they pretended they were going to follow the resolution, so they had to say Saddam Hussein was part of it. So that's when they concocted this story that he was entertaining the 9/11 attackers. It was all lies, all lies. But they justified the use of that resolution. But who would have ever dreamed that they would continue to do this and be involved in all of Africa now? You know, and it looks like it's all of Africa. It looks like we want to own Africa. But there's an end to this, and it's not going to continue to be smooth sailing. But for now, it's a mess. I'm glad they're debating this. I'm not overly optimistic they're going to come up with a good compromise. I wish they would, and the compromise being following the Constitution, you know, and getting away from this license to start wars. And it fits into Trump's philosophy. Keep everything secret. Don't ever put your cards on the table. You know, we can't let them know what we're doing. So if we tell, they said we can't tell the enemy. But what about telling the American people? Are we the enemy?
Yeah.
And that's the way they treat us. They treat us because we're the ones who get punished with an invasion of our civil liberties, destruction of our civil liberties, at the pretense of, you know, fighting the war on terrorism. But I think the American people have suffered so much more. But most of them are sort of, well, look, I think it's making us safer at the airports. And I don't think the statistics bear that out.
No. And you remember the great intelligence asset they had on Iraq. This is the guy all the intelligence reports cited. It was Curveball. His name was Curveball. He was a drunk who was totally unreliable. We didn't find that out until years later. Well, the same thing happens with Iran now. The MEK, which used to be considered a terrorist group, they still are. They're our main sources on Iran. They hate Iran. So the same thing happens over and over again.
Right.
You know? But my final thought would be simply that Secretary Mattis has essentially said to the Foreign Relations Committee, wars are too unpredictable. They shouldn't be restricted by Congress. But that would be the argument for Congress to get involved in the first place. And my final word is there are just a few hours left to get your Ron Paul personalized book at midnight tonight. We're going to have to close down the offer. $100 donation to the Ron Paul Institute. Go to ronpaulinstitute.org and you'll have more details on how to do that and get your Ron Paul, The Revolution at 10 Years.
Very good, very good. And I want to thank the audience for tuning in today. Of course, we consider this a very important issue and sort of anticipated that this debate would evolve in Washington. Where it's going, we don't know. We're not crossing our fingers and being overly hopeful that we're going to straighten out this mess. Because the way I see it, you have the Constitution, you have legislation and you have different people, you have political promises, it's all mixed up. But to me, what the bottom line is the character of the people that represent us. Because, you know, generally speaking, the peace candidate does win. Whether it was Johnson against Barry Goldwater, whether it was Nixon, and whether it was George Bush in 2000, he was speaking our terms. But it boils down to the character of the individuals. Say things that the people appeal to or scare people to death, but there's always an agenda. There's a neocon agenda, and they're very much in charge of the foreign policy. And also, if you have men and women of character, if they actually took their oath of office halfway serious, it would go a long way to solving some of these problems, but no, it's endless. And I think this is a reflection of what I mentioned a little while ago, and that is the difference between empire and a republic. And we've morphed into, it's been over 100 years, into an empire, and I don't know how anybody can deny this. And empires have to ignore the law, ignore the Constitution, and they have to lie to people. So it's empire depends on lies to exist. But the character of the individuals could iron a lot of this out, that if they do what they say and take the oath of office seriously and tell the people why policies are good. In many ways, the propaganda is why war is necessary and why stealing from one group and give it to another is a worthwhile philosophy, and it turns out that the wealthy steal from the middle class. If they were upfront and told the truth about economic policy and foreign policy, the people would respond. But what happens, though, is they talk a little bit about that, they soften their stand, they elect a person who thinks that, well, they're more of greater character and that they are more for peace, and at the same time, and it goes on endlessly, nothing ever changes. And that is why a detailed technical change in the authorization to use military force, you know, maybe it would move us in the right direction a little bit, but it's irrelevant, because it'll be like what they did in 2000, after 2011. If they don't like it, they ignore it. We ignore the Constitution, and they do what they want. And the recourse is in the court. There's questions about whether that's possible, but the only recourse in a society that pretends to believe in liberty is from the people. And the people have to be alert and send that message to Washington and not think that it's going to happen automatically and not think there's going to be a court ruling, then all of a sudden things are going to be solved. So that might be overly simplistic, but I think that is the way we should be going, rather than doing any more endorsing or toleration of this monolithic state that endorses, a constant, everlasting war. That is not good. Our vote here at this channel is for peace and prosperity, and I don't see how anybody can turn that down. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.